Now, to put it mildly, it's been an interesting few years for the Star Wars franchise and its fan base. The sequel trilogy, brought to us by Lucasfilm under the ownership of Disney, has driven some fans away entirely while forming a giant rift between many of those fans who do remain, and one that is very different from the rift or debate caused by the prequel trilogy over a decade earlier. Because in that case, with the prequels, it was mainly what you could call a in-universe debate. It was almost strictly an argument over the content of the movies themselves, or the quality of them, and the man who brought them to us, that of course being George Lucas. And if you happen to fall on the side that didn't like them, there was no assumption made about you or your character or decency as a person, other than maybe people thinking you were from the older crowd or those old enough to remember seeing the original trilogy when it was first coming out. And sure, let's be real, debates over the prequels did and can still get very heated, and they can devolve into name-calling, profanity use, and all that other fun stuff. But again, never was it really about attacking who you are as a person or questioning your values for not liking those films. It was always just about the films themselves. And never did this debate really capture the attention of the mainstream media. Never did you really hear or read articles being written about it from major or even minor news sources. And that's mainly because most critics took the side of those who didn't like the prequels. Most critics were not fans of the movies and hence sided with the quote-unquote haters in this particular case. And so why would you report on and disparage the group that, by default I guess, was on your side? And so there was never really any story there, no reason for the media to report on what they likely saw as nothing more than angry nerds arguing with each other over the content of a movie. But that's all changed with the sequels. The media has taken great interest in fan reaction to these films, and even made some interesting accusations of fans along the way, mainly that at least a somewhat sizable portion of them are sexist and or racist. They've basically said there's been something festering within the Star Wars fanbase since its very inception back in 1977 with that first film, and that the sequel trilogy has begun to expose it or root it out. And so what I want to do here is have this video be the first in perhaps a series of videos that explores the sequel trilogy inside and out. A look back at what happened with these movies and why, and how the fanbase has gotten to the point it's at now, and if anything can be done about it. And I thought, obviously, there's no better place to start than at the very beginning, at the start of the Disney era of Star Wars, to see what the state of the fanbase was like before the awakening, before the first movie ever came out, and how the media viewed fans back then, opposed to how they view them now. Okay, so our story really has to kick off on June 1st of 2012, a few months before Disney would purchase Lucasfilm. This is the day that, and it apparently came as a surprise to most experts, that George Lucas named Kathleen Kennedy the co-chair of Lucasfilm in an effort to begin the process of moving towards his eventual retirement. Kennedy at the time had been co-head of the Kennedy Marshall Production Company, along with her husband Frank Marshall. And along with this announcement, George Lucas put out a statement that you can feel free to pause and read now, but that essentially goes over the reasons why he picked her, that she was a friend of his and he felt like she was the best for the future of the company, for its employees, and the fans, and that she would ultimately honor his legacy by putting the same care into the films that he had. And though we can certainly debate how well she's done with all of that, at the time of this announcement, as far as I could find, there was no sort of reaction from the fanbase, good or bad. Likely it flew under the radar of all but the most dedicated and news-savvy of fans. Either way, there was no sort of uproar that all indications now pointed to the fact that a woman was going to be the future leader of Lucasfilm, none again that I could find. And do quickly note here that I've been doing research for this video and entire series for some time now, not to mention I kept up with much of this as it was happening back then. But as always, I greatly encourage you to do your own research to see what you can find on any or all of these topics. Even if it greatly conflicts with what I'm presenting here, I'd love to know about it. Because, yes, like all people, I obviously have my opinions, but most of all, I'm interested in truth here, and being as unbiased as I possibly can. Anyway, that announcement preceded the much larger announcement that came on October 30th of 2012, that George Lucas was selling Lucasfilm to Disney for roughly $4.05 billion, some of which would be paid to him in cash, some paid to him in Disney stock. And at this time, it was also announced that Kathleen Kennedy would, of course, be made president of Lucasfilm, and that she would also serve as the brand manager for Star Wars, working directly with Disney's global line of businesses to build, further integrate, and maximize the value of this global franchise. And though there was obviously a great deal of emotions experienced by fans over this announcement, that Disney now owned Star Wars and would be controlling its future, nobody seemed to talk about or care who the president of Lucasfilm now was. I could find virtually nothing about Kathleen Kennedy over the next few subsequent years, other than from business-oriented websites that talked about her illustrious career and her rise to the presidency of Lucasfilm, and in none of them was fan backlash even remotely hinted at. For all intents and purposes, fans didn't care one way or the other about Kathleen Kennedy. In fact, the only things from fans you can really find over those next few years in the wake of the changeover was news about the upcoming Star Wars Rebels, the first thing Disney was really going to unveil, as well as, of course, early speculation about Episode 7, but also anger over the sudden cancellation of Clone Wars and the wiping away of the EU. And needless to say, but there was plenty of unhappy fans at this point, yet nowhere did I really find any outrage aimed at Kathleen Kennedy herself. At this point, still no one seemed to care about Kennedy one way or the other. Nor did that really change in the direct lead up to The Force Awakens. You'd be very hard pressed to find any sort of fan outrage directed at Kennedy over anything she did or said as the film drew closer and closer to release. Most fans were just excited and hopeful for new Star Wars, and honestly didn't care about the race or gender of its characters or its president. They trusted, or again hoped, these characters would be handled well within the context of the story, and everything else about them be damned. And if you go back and look now or read the articles, you'll actually see that Kennedy was fairly vocal in the year or so preceding the release of The Force Awakens, talking about the importance of a character like Rey, the importance of a female lead in Star Wars movies, the importance of more women in Star Wars in general, and more people from more diverse backgrounds, and so on. And yet, there was barely any complaints about any of this from any fans. And I say barely because I did find many articles covering this one incident, this one question posed by a single random Facebook user that the official Star Wars account responded to, and what he asked or said was, "Not to be sexist, but it's really hard to tell that's a female armor for me," and he was referring to the way Captain Phasma looked. The official Star Wars account then responded, "It's armor on a woman, it doesn't have to be feminine." And again, this one question and the response caused a major commotion. Without even really trying, I found roughly a dozen articles on it. Even some major news outlets like CBS needed to cover this. And though, yes, we can debate how bad this question really is or isn't, we can debate exactly what he was asking here. Was he asking why there was nothing at all suggesting a woman was underneath the armor? Or was he asking why isn't she in a metal bikini looking sexy? And most articles seem to think he was asking for the latter. Anyway, this, as far as I could find, was perhaps the biggest thing the media pounced on in regards to sexism in the lead up to The Force Awakens, at least involving fans. This one incident involving the comment of one fan. And really, the more articles I read, the more I realized the media didn't seem to at all have their sights set on the fans. They had them set on corporations. I mean, there was a shirt sold by Target that showed a classic scene from A New Hope that replaced Leia with Luke that some people lost their mind over. There was also the whole "Where's Rey" thing that Hasbro faced right before and shortly after the movie came out, claiming that Hasbro purposely wasn't making toys and such associated with the character Rey, obviously. And this was mainly caused because Rey didn't get a piece in the Star Wars Monopoly game and wasn't in the Lego Millennium Falcon playset from Episode 7, and she was left out of several action figure bundle packs, even though, as a collector, I can tell you Rey was certainly represented in all the major action figure lines of the time, and had a Lego minifig in another set. There was also this article I found where, funny enough, Daisy Ridley reviewed 8 Star Wars toys from The Force Awakens that featured her likeness, so it didn't seem like she was completely missing. Basically, what I'm trying to get at here is that the accusations made against some fans today, or this belief that a sizable portion of the fan base hated Rey from the very start, from before the movies even came out, and that they were opposed to more female characters or any female characters or a female lead, doesn't seem to have much evidence. And the odd part here is the very few examples you can find, like this guy who asked the question on Facebook and got blasted for it, well, the article that responded to it always pointed at the individual. There is no wider assumption made about Star Wars fans on the whole in any of these articles, or a sizable portion of the fan base, because one guy on Facebook asked a question that could be interpreted as ignorant and or sexist. And so if there is a rot at the core of the fan base, if sexism is and has been a major problem, it certainly doesn't seem that portion of the fan base was angered over the announcement or coming of a female lead. something that was not kept secret before the movie came out. We all knew Rey was going to be one of the main characters, if not the main character of the whole trilogy. And along these same lines, another character we were told was going to be a main character, and we even had it teased in the trailers he was going to be a Jedi, was Finn, played by John Boyega. And one thing I often hear brought up is all the racist remarks he faced when the first trailer of The Force Awakens premiered back in November of 2014, and when, in that trailer, the first thing we saw was a black stormtrooper. And in response, yes, black stormtrooper started trending on Twitter. There were certainly some people that said some terrible things about him. Plenty of articles then sprung up covering all this. But it's also interesting to go back and read some of them now, from when it was actually happening, which again is back in late 2014 if you go care to take a look. Because though the narrative now seems to be some Star Wars fans were racist and hated Finn from the very start, back then it was a very different story. Once again, oddly enough, distinctions were being made by those in the media. Many articles pointed out that all the hate was seemingly coming from members of white supremacist groups who were not actually fans but were still advocating for the boycott of Episode 7, but that they were being drowned out on Twitter and elsewhere by real Star Wars fans. These articles would even go out of their way to point out that many Star Wars fans weren't being racist intentionally when they asked, why is there a black stormtrooper? They simply didn't know the lore. Because a lot of people wrongly assumed, because of the clone troopers in the prequels, that all stormtroopers were still clones during the time of the Empire, which then meant perhaps they were still clones during the time of the sequel trilogy. This was about confusion, not necessarily racism, at least not for everybody, because yes, there were some actual racists who tried to get this thing going, but again, they were shut down by real fans, and once the confusion was cleared up, you never really heard anything about Finn again. You never saw any articles covering any other incidents in regards to racism in the fandom. And that's not because nobody anywhere was saying anything else bad about Finn being black or Rey being a woman. I'm by no means saying nobody was saying anything against them, nor am I defending anyone who would or did. I'm only saying that the media didn't seem to recognize or talk about any sort of widespread issue in the fan base. And yet, now I see many in the media, as well as some fellow fans, who talk about how there has always been outrage for these characters since before the movies even started to come out. But there really isn't evidence to support that, none that the media wanted to report on back then. And the simple reason for that is why you don't see any type of widespread dislike of these characters from the fan base is because back then, fans only cared about what the eventual movie or movies would be. They had hope for these characters. They wanted them to be good, to become classic characters. The only ones really making a big deal about the race and gender of these new heroes before the movies came out was the media. And one thing I found during my research were countless articles that came out in the year leading up to the movie talking about their hopes for the sequel trilogy or the top 5 things they want to see in them. And guess what? Most of the time, these articles from the media weren't talking about the actual story. They weren't talking about what these movies would mean in the universe. They were talking about what it would mean outside of it, what it could mean for women, minorities, and diversity in general. They didn't care about the story, they cared about what these movies could represent. And contrary to current popular belief, almost all fans are fine with diversity in Star Wars. Virtually none of them are or were against it then or against it now, which is why you didn't see any sort of backlash to any of these articles talking about their hopes and dreams for Star Wars that had nothing to do with the story. Back then, you didn't see Star Wars YouTube channels back in 2014 and 15, before the first film came out, talking about the issue of forced diversity. You only found a whole lot of hype and excitement for these characters and everything else Star Wars. And that's because, again, all that matters to most fans is whether or not the story and the characters within it are good. Plain and simple. We can even once more go back to the prequel trilogy and see how true that is. The argument there was all about quality of the story and the characters, nothing else. Many fans think Anakin Skywalker, in Episode 2 especially, is pretty bad all around, yet we'd laugh at the notion that it's because he's played by a young, straight white male. And so what began to happen after The Force Awakens and fully bloomed after The Last Jedi was suddenly a lot of fans weren't happy with the quality of the movies. They didn't think these characters were all that great, which of course didn't really matter all that much to some of those in the media who had more hopes for what these movies would represent instead of how good they'd actually be, how good the story would be. And so the rejection by some fans of the movies and the characters within was intentionally conflated by some in the media with a rejection of the underlying message they wanted to see preached by these movies. If you don't like Rey, it doesn't mean you just didn't like a character in a movie. It means you don't like either women or what she was meant to represent. And suddenly there was a story there. Suddenly what the media just saw as angry nerds when it came to the prequels became a much, much bigger story that they could sell and profit from, which is something I hope to get more into in the next part of this series. Well, that's all I've got for this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think or what you remember. Was there widespread rejection of Rey, Finn, and Kathleen Kennedy, or any of the other characters or actors before The Force Awakens came out? Or is the media revising history to fit the current narrative? Whatever you think, leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.